Hello and good morning, everybody. It is me, Julian, and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. Today, I want to discuss Today, I want to discuss the madness of Slavoj Žižek's philosophy, or what you might also call the ontological necessity of madness. And one of the distinguishing features of Slavoj Žižek's philosophy, perhaps even of his system, if you will, is that he places an emphasis on the constitutive necessity of madness. Zizek is a madman philosopher, as it were, and he employs Hegel and Lacan to make an argument for madness. As Zizek himself puts it quite succinctly, what is the fall from reason into madness compared to the madness of reason itself? And so what I'd like to do in this short video is to essentially talk a little bit about the role that the concept of madness plays in Zizek's thinking, in his philosophy. I'll talk a little bit more about his style, if you will, and how he himself navigates the idea of the madman philosopher, the archetype, if you will. And I'd like to then relate it also to the ontological philosophical argument that Zizek makes about madness. Perhaps it's important to note that the word madness here is not meant in a clinical sense, but instead in a philosophical one, which is to say madness, as it is usually conceptualized in the Enlightenment tradition, is the fall from reason into madness. One of Zizek's central arguments, however, is that the Hegelian turn represents, if you will, the turn of madness, the essentialization of madness as constitutive to the subject, as a vanishing mediator, if you will, between the pure animal life world towards the higher form of living in the symbolic order. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We will get to this in a moment. First of all, I would like to say thank you to our patrons. These lectures come courtesy of our community of patrons. And if you'd like to become a patron, one of the perks is that you can download the complete guide to Zizek ebook series that I've posted to Patreon. You can also find the audio uploads for every lecture on Patreon, as well as a bonus Q&A seminar that I record live with patrons and post after each and every lecture. So thank you to our patrons, and above all, I would like to invite you to join our community, as it really is a very fun project for me to have an in-group, as it were. Okay, so let us begin. As I said before, Žižek is a madman philosopher, by which I mean that he both performs the figure of the philosophical madman, but also that madness has a very central role to play in his philosophical argument. On a very basic level, to simplify somewhat, you could of course make the argument that to be sane in a world that is mad is itself a form of insanity. Zizek's argument on its most basic level, on the surface level, is that to be frustrated, to be angry, to be neurotic is the most logical response to modern life. That the well-adjusted, non-alienated subject is therefore the subject of contemporary modern madness. And vice versa, the hysterical subject, the subject who questions, the subject who identifies the gaps and the cracks within the symbolic order, is therefore the enlightened figure of reason par excellence, or what Žižek would characterize as the philosopher. Hence why Žižek argues that the task of the philosopher is to inhabit these gaps, these cracks, to investigate them further, and to essentially bring them about, to make people aware of them. This means that the traditional Enlightenment narrative is no longer how the fall into madness is possible, but rather, from a Žižekian Hegelian perspective, how can the subject climb out of madness, especially if the ultimate madness is what appears to be reason in day-to-day reality. Once again, Žižek says, what is the fall from reason into madness compared to the madness which is reason, the reason of day-to-day life? To quote the Mad Hatter, Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter, we are all mad here, as it were. To exist in the world, to participate in day-to-day life in the symbolic order, requires a certain madness. And for Žižek, this madness is constitutive. But let me take a step back for a moment and go back to some of the psychoanalytic influences. Žižek often cites Freud here. Freud says that the paranoiac, like the conspiracy theorist, is not necessarily a madman. Instead, a conspiracy theorist looks at the contingency of the world, the radical unpredictability of the real, as it were, and tries to impose upon it some system of meaning. Everything happens for a reason. Hence, the paranoiac, the conspiracy theorist, is confronted with the radical contingency of the world and tries to make sense of it, tries to stay alive so as to not succumb to despair by means of imposing a system of reason upon it. Of course, the system of reason is itself the ultimate form of madness. Most conspiracy theories are highly illogical and yet present themselves as a formal system, a methodological framework of sorts. Hence why Žižek says that when it comes to the paranoiac and the conspiracy theorist in particular, we are tempted to describe it as a Kantian paralogism of reason, which is to say the universal suspicion of all received knowledge, scientific opinion, etc., the powers that be, is itself turned into a formal methodological system by which it is positivized so that everything makes sense, an all-encompassing theory. Hence, it becomes the very thing that it is suspicious of. Susan Sontag once joked that she wished that she were a paranoiac because at least for a paranoiac, everything happens for a reason. Žižek's basic argument, therefore, is that the world as we receive it, as we see it, frightens us and disorients us precisely in its contingency, in the radical accidental nature of its becoming and unfolding. Hence, the subjective stance is, of course, to try to impose some system of reason upon this madness. And the ultimate system of reason, which is imposed upon the radically contingent madness of the real, is, of course, the symbolic order. To exist and constitute oneself as a subject in the symbolic, whether it's your professional identity, whether it's your religious identity, etc., is itself a kind of madness, is itself a kind of play or illusion. And Žižek says that this madness, this constitutive madness, is actually necessary for the subject. And here he's very Hegelian. The Hegelian argument is always the opposite of the Enlightenment narrative. The Enlightenment narrative is that the subject is the light of reason that can illuminate the darkness. Whereas for Hegel, the subject is the place of absolute or pure negativity, the night of the world. That when the subject retreats into itself, radically detaches itself from its surroundings, this is precisely when it can then assume the constitutive madness of its own becoming. Or, to put it somewhat less obtuse, Hegel's basic argument is that in order to become a person, a subject, you first have to radically step outside of it and reflect on who you are, who you would like to be, assume and accept the radical contingency of reality, and therefore realize that you can be your own master. You can play different roles. Instead of looking for the true authentic source of your being, you can essentially step into life and perform a role that you find to be agreeable to your life. In a sense, this is still a reification of the romantic notion that life is a work of art, that, or in contemporary TikTok parlance, that life is a movie. Life is a theatrical journey in which you have to write your own story. Now, of course, in contemporary capitalist modern terms, this individualization, if you will, by which you believe that you are the main character in your own movie, is itself one of the symptoms of alienation. We feel lost, we feel depressed, we don't know how to access either our inner life worlds or any kind of meaningful interaction with others. And so we romanticize the idea of our own inner journey, of our own Bildungsroman, as it were. And yet there's a romantic notion here that originates around the time of the 19th century, which is precisely this idea of the individual asserting himself against radical negativity. And yet the Hegelian inversion is to place this radical negativity back into the subject as such. The subject is this radical negativity, and hence the constitutive necessity of madness. Madness is the truth of the subject. Hence, it is no longer the Schellingian idea that we have the void from which the subject stems. Instead, Hegel transposes the gap between the void and the subject back into the subject himself. And this is the key argument for Slavoj Žižek, the radical negativity that lies within the heart of the subject, for which and to which Žižek gives the name of the Lacanian real. Hence, Žižek's theory of madness is not a binary between reason and madness. It's not about how do we escape madness so as to level up to reason, the classic Enlightenment narrative. Instead, Žižek's argument is that subjectivity has as its inner core a constitutive necessity for madness, what he calls the ontological necessity of madness. Then his polemical or political argument is that in an alienated world, to be a non-neurotic, well-adapted subject is itself the height of madness. Hence, Žižek argues in a very Lacanian way in favor of madness, whether it's hysteria, the radical questioning of our relationship to the other, or simply the embrace of the mask that we wear that gives us access to the symbolic order. Žižek's formula, if you will, is that the subject who recognizes his own madness is thereby sane, whereas the subject who believes himself to be sane is the one who is most mad. And I think that arguably you can actually see this reflected back in Žižek's own work and in his delivery of his ideas. When you first confront Žižek's, or when you are first confronted with Žižek's work, when you read him or when you listen to his lectures, it seems like they're all over the place. Like it's simply an associative performance by which he jumps from cinema to philosophy to scatological jokes back to political provocations. And certainly there's, I think, an improvised element here. Žižek returns to his greatest hits over and over again. But fundamentally, this is itself a system to which Žižek is very slavishly, if you will, addicted almost. He has to go into everything so as to keep on repeating one thing. And the central argument that Žižek keeps repeating over and over and over again is this combination of Lacanian psychoanalysis, the theory of the real, with the constitutive negativity of the Hegelian post-metaphysical turn. And this means that Žižek himself is a madman philosopher of sorts. He's drawing everything in to his argument, into what is essentially his system. Now, it's important to note, and I think that sometimes this is easy to miss, is that when Žižek first starts using Lacan in this specific way, part of the Slovenian school that essentially applies Lacanian psychoanalysis to the reconfiguration of Hegelian, Kantian, and Marxist themes, this is a very unpopular thing to do. Lacan at that point is at his least trendy. Essentially, Lacan himself is rejected as either a fraud or a madman thinker. And Žižek is attracted to Lacan in this very specific sense, which is to say, Žižek is not espousing Lacanian theory as a clinical method. In fact, Žižek, in his PhD thesis, which would later become his first book, The Most Sublime Hysteric, which is how Lacan refers to Hegel, is very open about his method. He says, my method is to never refer to Lacan when he speaks about Hegel or appears to allude to him. Instead, whenever Lacan isn't talking about Hegel, I will apply his concepts back to Hegel. In other words, Žižek attempts this totally crazy idea to take Lacanian concepts, most famously the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, and apply them to Hegelian metaphysics, thereby creating an entirely new Hegel. And Žižek's argument about madness actually continues even further. He says that every single philosopher misses the most important point of their central insight. In a sense, they have to be bastardized. They have to be refracted back upon themselves by a thinker who appears antithetical to them. Once again, Lacanian psychoanalysis and Hegelian philosophy don't appear to be at all compatible. The Lacanian psychoanalytic practice is anti-philosophical to the extreme. Over and over again, Lacan's structuralism expresses itself as being skeptical, perhaps even dismissive of the project of philosophy as such. And so Žižek bastardizes, if you will, to use a loaded word, Lacanian concepts, not because he gets them wrong, but because he uses them against Lacan's attention so as to demonstrate how Lacanian concepts reveal the truth, as he puts it, of Hegelian positions. Hence, for Žižek, Hegel can't be understood directly. In fact, Hegel could not be properly understood in his own time. His argument is that the Lacanian turn retroactively reveals to us Hegel in its most true or authentic guise. And you can understand why this appears to be methodological madness, and certainly appeared to many of his peers to be this way. Vice versa, not only did Žižek embrace Lacan, which was very unpopular at the time, but he essentially appropriated the method of cultural studies, the engagement with cinema and popular culture, but argued strongly against deconstructionism and postmodernism and cultural studies. In fact, Žižek has been consistently critical of cultural studies and post-colonial theory. And so he took what appeared to be the method of cultural studies and used it against itself. Namely, used it so as to stage a return to a Lacanian interpretation of Hegelian metaphysics, a deeply untrendy and deeply unpopular thing to do. It's ironic, of course, to some extent, that from today's perspective, when Žižek's philosophy is all over the internet and very accessible to many people, that this turn, in a sense, has lost its most radical quality. It doesn't seem like a gesture of madness anymore. It's also important to note that Žižek's first PhD thesis was rejected because it was considered insufficiently Marxist. The Lacanian Hegelian turn was for a long time considered a betrayal of orthodox Marxism. Žižek's argument, of course, over and over again, has been that if we return to Hegel through a Lacanian lens, it will also shed a different light upon the work of Marx. But this is a lengthy aside, so I would like to briefly return to the theme of madness, if you will. So Žižek's basic argument, and this is where he draws most strongly upon Hegel, is that the transition from the animal world, from naive integration into reality, you live according to your nature. The transition from animal soul, as Hegel calls it, towards modern man isn't a direct transition. It's not simply that we go from animal integration into the natural world towards a higher, enlightened sense of self. Instead, Žižek says that the vanishing mediator between the animal world and the world of modern man is madness, a kind of constitutive madness. And for Žižek, the key point, the crux, the key event in this transition is the Cartesian cogito. The Cartesian cogito for Žižek is not the moment of man's enlightenment, of man's ascent towards self-reflective wisdom and knowing. Instead, for Žižek, the Cartesian cogito marks the hystericization of the subject, marks the moment of constitutive madness in the subject. It is from the perspective of the Cartesian cogito that animal life, which is fully integrated into its surroundings, appears as a kind of folly or madness. In other words, even the echo of the Cartesian formula, I think, therefore I am, should be read to its completion, which is I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. The critical moment of the Cartesian cogito, the self-transparent subject, I think, therefore I am, therefore is predicated upon doubt. And doubt for Žižek is always related to hysteria. Hysteria is not simply the misogynistic trope about women who are unhappy being domesticated at their homes, etc. Instead, from a Freudian Lacanian perspective, hysteria is the radical questioning of our relationship to the other. The hysterical question is, what am I to you? Hence, the logical continuation of the question, what am I to you, is, what am I to myself? And seen in this light, the Cartesian cogito, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am, brings about, if you will, its hysterical inverse. If I doubt, how can I be certain of anything? How can I be certain of myself? And in order to become certain of yourself, you must be ratified by the other. And the other, therefore, exists on the level of the symbolic order. To prove to yourself that you exist, you must enter into symbolic communion with the other. You have to don a symbolic mantle, wear a mask, whether it's your professional identity, whether it's your gender identity, your religious identity, etc. Hence why Žižek is very critical of identity politics. For Žižek, identity politics represents both, or perhaps at best, the essentialization of identity that essentially disregards the constitutive madness of all identity as such. But moreover, from a Hegelian perspective, Žižek argues that identity politics falls prey to what Žižek calls, to what Hegel calls a false universal, an infinite regression, if you will, by which identity has to create multiple branches upon which it rests its authenticity. Hence, to speak from the perspective of identity is itself a kind of madness. To say, this is who I am certain of it, and I will essentially base my politics and my reality upon this foundation. For Žižek, there is no foundation upon which identity can be based. Identity is always itself a hysterical response to the non-identity of the subject as such. This doesn't mean that the subject should revert into the void, escape into non-identity. The idea of being colorblind is of course itself a kind of identity. The rejection of identity is an identity. But Žižek says that the subject should be well aware of the falsity of identity, that identity and identity politics gives us the illusion of a solution, when in fact it only essentially worsens the problem. Žižek says that one of the contemporary political issues we face, therefore, today is that even reactionary politics present themselves as identity politics, the plight of the white man, etc. The voice of the voiceless no longer being those of minorities, but instead the average white American who presents themselves as the true minority, the true voiceless, etc. Žižek's argument is that identity politics therefore presents an infinite regression, and it essentially obfuscates the truth that identity is always a mask which we wear so as to cover up the void that lies at the heart of the subject as such. It's important to note, however, that Žižek's argument against identity politics is a left-wing one, which is to say, it's not simply saying that identity politics is a regression and we should return to the fixed hierarchy of male, female, etc. And that his argument is that if we want to be properly emancipated, if we want to be properly free, we must identify identity as a fake. That underneath identity there lies a much more radically open core, a core which frightens us. And this frightening core is precisely freedom at its most potent. In fact, Žižek is very consistent and quite Kantian here. For Slavoj Žižek, freedom is never something that makes us particularly happy. Freedom doesn't release us, as it were. Freedom comes to us as a radical disruption, as something which frightens us, which confronts us with our own agency. It compels us to act. Žižek contrasts freedom, which in a Kierkegaardian sense, he says makes us anxious, the Kierkegaardian formula being that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Žižek contrasts this with habit. And here, once again, he's very Hegelian. Hegel emphasizes over and over again the importance of habit. And the Hegelian Kantian argument is that habit is how we become free by means of making ourselves unfree. And yet, when we act according to habit, we essentially are repeating ourselves. We are acting in a way that is mad. In embracing a habit, you are essentially returning to what appears as the animal bliss. I'm simply living in accordance with my nature. And yet, by means of doing so, you embrace the properly subjective stance of choosing what to dedicate yourself to. Žižek's argument, therefore, is that the ultimate act of reason is to be so crazy so as to dedicate yourself entirely to your craft or to your habit. Once again, we have here the Hegelian theme of the inward turn, the man who recoils into himself so as to do what he believes to be most important. And the image that Žižek likes to use here is the image of zombies. Žižek's formula is, we are all zombies. Now, in the traditional cultural studies sense, this would usually appear to be a bad thing. Like Romero's Dawn of the Dead is essentially a metaphor of sorts for alienated life in a consumer society. That even once we are the walking dead, we go back to the mall. That to be a consumer in contemporary capitalist America is to live like a zombie, to believe that you are asserting your own individual identity by means of behaving as everybody else does. And yet that's not really Žižek's point. Žižek is actually arguing in favor of the zombie. Žižek says that when we are like zombies, when we're simply going through the motions, when we're living a life of habit and discipline and routine, this is when we are most content. This is when we are happiest, when we are able to some extent, dedicate ourselves completely to what we want to do. Here you can see a link, for those of you who have followed these lectures, between the Lacanian concept of subjective destitution and the figure of the zombie. The zombie is subjectively destitute. And yet Žižek is a bit of a Kantian here. Žižek's argument is that you can't simply be a zombie as a puppet, i.e. somebody else is pulling your strings. Instead, for Žižek, you have to become the master of your own puppet, the puppet which is you. And so in a sense, you are a zombie, but a zombie who is nevertheless in charge of being a zombie. You are simply feigning to be a zombie. You are living a zombie-like life. Once again, we can go back to the original theme. If you believe yourself to be free, you are actually acting like a zombie, a boring capitalist consumer doing what everybody else does, and yet believing yourself to be really independent. Like, I don't know, coloring your hair, getting tattoos, etc., an expression of your own personal identity. I have nothing against this, by the way, which nevertheless is the most common thing to do. Resistance as the norm, as it were. Against this, to impose upon yourself a kind of monastical seriousness, a kind of purpose that you dedicate yourself to completely, is to make yourself appear like a zombie to others, but in a sense to be completely free, spiritually and intellectually. You're doing exactly what you want to be doing. Hence, Žižek locates the zombie as a figure of madness. The zombie who believes himself to be free, a refraction of the Kantian argument that the slave who believes himself to be free is the ultimate slave, is contrasted by Žižek with the person who makes himself a zombie, who practices subjective destitution, who imposes a libidinal economy of habit and discipline upon his own life. And this means that you become a madman of sorts, and yet you are living a life of reason. Žižek's own life. He spends all of his time reading and watching movies and writing about those books and writing about those movies and taking everything that exists and putting them back into his philosophical system. Žižek is a madman in that sense. He has completely dedicated himself to one project. And whilst his work appears to be saying different things all the time, jumping from one topic to the next, you can go back over all of his 50 books and you will see that the same arguments are repeated over and over in a very disciplined fashion. And so Žižek isn't simply repeating himself. He is dedicating himself, like a zombie, if you will, to one theme over and over and over again, and finding new ways to express it. Against this, the contemporary public intellectual would be the person who is a man of all interests, who writes a book about science and a book about public speaking and a book about gardening, etc., who essentially does a little bit of everything. Žižek's system is the other way around. It takes everything and it radically solipsizes it into one idea, his Leitmotiv or Grundeinsicht, if you will, namely Lacan with Hegel. And so once again, the ontological necessity of madness comes through in at least three ways. To summarize, 1, we have the ontological necessity of madness in a Hegelian sense, which is to say Hegel argues that the true enlightenment is not to prevent a fall from reason into madness, but instead to see how madness is constitutive, how madness is the turn away from the integration into the animal world so as to enter into the symbolic order. This means that the very discomfort of the subject, the hysteria of the Cartesian cogito, who am I, is a necessary step towards the integration of the subject into the symbolic order. In other words, to acquire reason. Reason is therefore simply the after effect of this madness, what Hegel calls the night of the worlds, or the constitutive negativity of the subject, or even more technically, the self-relating negativity, which is the subject. From a Lacanian perspective, therefore, hysteria is the mode of reason. To radically question one's relationship to the other is therefore an emancipatory stance. Vice versa, to be fully integrated into your life worlds, to simply be a happy, well-adjusted, hardworking consumer, landlord, capitalist, is essentially the height of madness. And so Žižek uses Lacan and Hegel to also, number 3, make a polemical argument, namely, what is the fall from reason into madness compared to the madness which is reason itself? In a world that has gone insane, perhaps the ultimate insanity is to believe oneself sane. And vice versa, in a world that has gone insane, perhaps to be sane is to become insane. Hence, Žižek places a philosophical onus, if you will, on madness, on the self-relating negativity of the subject, a subject which appears to be the spoke in the wheel of the metaphysical idealist system. After all, the Kantian critical turn is already the identification of the subject as this irreducible dilemma, the indivisible remainder within the traditional system of idealism. Žižek's argument, in a very Hegelian way, is that this madness, however, is not the exception. It is not the problem which defeats metaphysics. Instead, it is the very solution. It is from the stance of the mad, hysterical, alienated subject, the post-metaphysical subject of the Cartesian turn, who does not have access to things in themselves. It is from this very stance that metaphysics reinvents itself, and vice versa, that the critique of contemporary society and the tradition of Marxism might reinvent itself. Hence, to put this very simply, Žižek is a madman philosopher, because for Žižek, to be mad is to speak truth. Therefore, there's an ontological necessity of madness. And the more insane a philosophy is, the more reasonable it is. And yet, as a final addendum, this doesn't mean that we should simply spout nonsense and thereby declare it wisdom. Instead, it is to be radically suspicious of wisdom and any system of thought that presents itself in a binary form. The very idea of the dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic and the Marxist dialectic, is the, if you will, moment of madness that is identified within the illusion of reason as such. Hence, philosophy in the post-metaphysical turn, which initiates with Kant but finds its full fruition in Hegel, is essentially a demystification of the idea of reason. It is a critical stance towards the supposed certainty of the Cartesian cogito. And Žižek is a madman philosopher, not just because he presents himself as this, highfalutin contingent thinker. Žižek is also a madman because he says that this is the truth of contemporary philosophy, the madness of modern philosophy. The Cartesian cogito is not the turn towards reason and self-reflective distancing of the subject. Instead, the Cartesian cogito is the introduction of an irreducible madness into the metaphysical system of philosophy as such. Hence, Žižek elevates madness to a central point in his philosophical system, and in so doing, identifies the importance of madness to the so-called Hegelian post-metaphysical turn. That is my short lecture. I realize that this is a little bit abstract, so please do consider watching some of my other lectures, and that might help you piece it together. You can download the complete guide to Žižek ebook on my Patreon, or download the audio lectures on Patreon as well. And for those of you who are patrons, I will see you in the seminar on Discord in mere moments. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week.